I'm going to say something quietly, but it's going to trigger that subtle alarm in the back of your mind. The world is in the middle of a countdown nobody announced. A countdown that doesn't show up on charts, isn't mentioned on news panels, and rarely gets acknowledged even by the experts who sense it. And the strangest part, everything still looks normal. People commute to work, cities glow at night, the rhythm of daily life continues without a single skipped beat. Yet beneath that rhythm, there's a tremor light, distant, but impossible to ignore once you feel it. This video is the moment you start feeling it. This story doesn't begin with sirens or flashing red numbers. Big changes almost never do. They begin with a faint disturbance, like a breeze slipping through a closed window. You can't see it. You can't explain it. But it's there, whispering a message you don't yet understand. Economies appear strong, technology advances, optimism fills the air, but something beneath the surface is shifting. Something that doesn't match the brightness of the lights or the confidence of the headlines. Let me take you back 15 years. The dust of the last crisis had settled, commentators were celebrating a return to normal, and people were rebuilding with relief. But hidden in that hopeful period was a tiny indicator easy to ignore but impossible to erase once noticed. One nation quietly ramped up borrowing. Then another. Then corporations. Then ordinary people. This wasn't just numbers rising. It was the future being mortgaged piece by piece. And that was the moment the countdown quietly began. Now fast forward to today. That same chain of debt has tightened, link by link. Governments keep spending. Consumers keep buying. Corporations keep shouting about growth. But underneath all of it, an invisible weight is pressing downward. Imagine a bridge carrying more and more cars every year. From above, traffic flows smoothly. But inside the steel beams, microfractures are widening. They don't make noise. They don't draw attention. But they are real. And eventually they matter. Picture this. A financial analyst is packing up to leave the office late at night. Before shutting down her computer, she checks one last chart. Everything looks fine, except for one small line item nobody talks about. That number shows a nation's debt accelerating at a speed never seen before. She freezes for a moment, reading it twice, but then she closes the laptop and heads home. Nobody wants to be the person who says out loud that something is fundamentally wrong. Silence feels safer. Silence feels normal. In this first section of the video, we're peeling back that silence. We're examining a world that seems stable, yet leans ever so slightly toward a direction nobody wants to acknowledge. And in the next section, I'm going to show you why this countdown has been hiding in plain sight and why almost no one is seeing it. But here's the unsettling part. During these shifts, no one hits the alarm button. The system loves quiet. Quiet means order, and order means people stop asking questions. But this calm may not be calm at all. It may be the eerie stillness that arrives just before a storm decides to break. And if you listen closely, not to the headlines, not to the optimism, but to the subtle distortions underneath, you'll notice something else. The pattern has happened before. Civilizations rarely fall in the moment of chaos people remember. They fall in the quiet years leading up to it, when warning signs blend into the noise of everyday life. That is where we are right now, in the quiet part of the story. And the next section will reveal the first hidden signal, an early shift so subtle most people walked right past it, unaware that it would change everything that followed. Because once you see that first signal, you can't unsee it. It reframes the entire timeline, and suddenly every small tremor starts to make sense. Everything connects. To understand the first hidden signal, you have to picture a world that looks perfectly steady from the outside. Instead of a dramatic collapse or a sudden shock, the shift began with something deceptively small. A slowdown in the world's ability to create real value. Not money, not credit. Real value, things people actually need. Productivity growth, the engine that keeps economies alive, started cooling down. It wasn't obvious at first. It didn't show up in headlines. But it was there, nudging the system in a direction no one wanted to admit. Imagine a massive ship crossing the ocean. If the rudder shifts by just 1 degree, nobody on deck notices. But continue long enough in that direction, and the ship ends up hundreds of miles from its intended course. That's what happened to the global economy. Year after year, productivity slowed. And instead of correcting the course, governments replaced missing progress with borrowed money. Debt became the new fuel. But debt doesn't move the ship forward, it only makes it feel like it is still moving. The first hidden signal was this: growth stopped being earned and started being simulated. Households borrowed to maintain lifestyles that wages no longer supported. Companies borrowed to inflate stock prices instead of innovating. Governments borrowed to buy time. Borrowed time is still time, but it always expires. And when it does, the bill arrives all at once. To most people, life felt normal. But underneath, a strange mismatch began forming. Prices rose faster than incomes. Housing costs accelerated far beyond what young people could afford. Corporations posted record profits, yet workers' purchasing power quietly shrank. This wasn't a crisis, it was the slow formation of one. A pressure that didn't explode but accumulated. Then came the moment almost nobody noticed. Central banks realized they were trapped. If they raised interest rates, the system would crack under the weight of its own debt. If they kept rates low, inflation would eventually devour the currency. Either path led to consequences no one wanted to speak aloud. And so for years they tried to balance on a wire stretched above a canyon. It looked graceful, but up close, you could see the tremble in every step. The next hidden signal emerged from this impossible balance. When interest rates stayed artificially low, something fundamental broke: the price of risk. Investments that should have been considered dangerous suddenly looked safe. Money flooded into anything that moved tech startups with no profit, housing markets already stretched thin, complex financial products no one fully understood. Risk wasn't eliminated. It was disguised. This created a new illusion. The illusion that the world had entered a permanently stable era. But stability built on false assumptions is the most fragile kind. It lasts just long enough for people to forget what instability looks like. What followed was predictable in hindsight. Asset bubbles expanded. Inequality widened as those closest to the financial system benefited first. Supply chains stretched across the planet, optimized for efficiency instead of resilience. It worked until the first external shock hit, and the system wobbled harder than anyone predicted. But before we get to that moment, there's one more piece of the puzzle you need to see. A shift so subtle it blended perfectly into normal life. The rise of reactive decision-making. Policymakers weren't planning years ahead anymore. They were patching leaks as they appeared. Every solution created imbalances and flaws. The system wasn't guided. It was managed day by day, crisis by micro-crisis, until the line between normal and unstable blurred. In the next section, we're going to explore that shock, the moment the countdown sped up, revealing just how vulnerable the world had become. Once you see how quickly stability can flip into chaos, you'll understand why the quietest years often hide the loudest turning points. The shock that accelerated the countdown didn't arrive with explosions or dramatic headlines. It came softly, almost politely, disguised as a temporary disruption. It began as a supply chain slowdown, something experts brushed off as a short-term inconvenience. But beneath that label was the moment the world discovered just how fragile its systems had become. The slowdown wasn't the cause of the crisis. It was the flashlight that illuminated every hidden weakness all at once. For years, businesses had stretched their supply lines across continents, shaving costs wherever possible. Efficiency was king. Resilience was an afterthought. Factories in one corner of the world depended on materials from another, timing every shipment down to the day. It worked flawlessly until the first delay hit. One missed shipment became two. Two became 10. Suddenly, companies realized they were standing on a web so thin that a single vibration could send the entire structure trembling. And the trembling began quickly. Products disappeared from shelves. Prices jumped. Companies that had spent years bragging about precision logistics were now scrambling just to keep basic operations running. The slowdown exposed a truth most people had forgotten. Complexity is fragile. And the modern world was built on layers of it. People expected a quick fix. Governments spent, corporations improvised. But the underlying problem wasn't logistical, it was structural. The world had become dependent on systems that required perfect conditions to function, and the shock proved that perfection was never a realistic expectation. Then the deeper consequences appeared. Inflation surged as shortages collided with rising demand. Interest rates, held near zero for years, suddenly became a trap. Central banks tried to cool the economy, but every move risked triggering the very collapse they feared. It was like fighting flames in a room wired with danger. Any move could trigger worse. The countdown accelerated because the shock did more than disrupt supplies. It shattered the illusion of control. For the first time in decades, people realized that governments and institutions were reacting, not leading. Instead of shaping the future, they were being dragged by it. And once that realization spread, confidence, one of the few assets holding the system together, began to erode. Confidence doesn't disappear loudly. It fades quietly, like a light dimming in a long hallway. Investors pulled back first, shifting money into safe assets. Companies followed by canceling long-term plans. Households became cautious, reducing spending. Every small retreat amplified the next. A feedback loop formed, tightening the pressure with each cycle. That's when markets started to swing violently. Not because of a single event, but because no one knew which pillar would fail next. Uncertainty became the dominant force. And uncertainty is the oxygen of crisis. But here's the part people still underestimate. The shock wasn't the climax, it was the introduction. It revealed the cracks, but it didn't cause them. The real story begins after the cracks appear, when decision makers try to repair a system already under strain. Before we go there, you need to understand one more shift triggered by the shock. Expectations changed. For years, people assumed shelves would stay full, prices would stay stable, and growth would continue endlessly. The shock rewired that belief. Suddenly, the impossible felt possible again: shortages and volatility. And once the world remembers that stability is not guaranteed, everything about how people behave begins to change. And in the next section, we'll examine those decisions, the ones meant to stabilize the world, but that ultimately pushed it closer to the edge. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment isn't when something breaks. It's when people attempt to fix it without understanding how deep the damage goes. Stability slipped unnoticed. The moment leaders tried to fix the system was the moment the countdown accelerated again. Not because they acted with bad intentions, but because they acted inside a machine they no longer fully understood. Each lever they pulled created ripples they didn't anticipate. Every intervention meant to stabilize the world ended up shifting. Pressure somewhere else, like squeezing one end of a balloon only to watch the other side bulge unpredictably. This was the beginning of the policy whiplash era, where decisions swung violently between extremes. Governments tried stimulus, then austerity, then stimulus again. Central banks tightened, loosened, paused, reversed. Corporations overcorrected with layoffs, then scrambled to rehire. None of it brought balance. It only proved how deeply the global economy depended on assumptions that no longer held true. Behind every choice was the same unspoken fear. What if the entire structure could no longer return to equilibrium? The first major decision misfire came when policymakers attempted to fight inflation aggressively. Interest rates were lifted at a speed modern economies had never experienced. The intention was to cool overheating systems, but the effect was more chaotic. Housing markets froze. Businesses halted long-term projects. Debt payments ballooned. Households felt the squeeze instantly. The medicine worked, but like a dose too strong, it risked harming the patient. Then came the second misfire, reacting to the pain they'd created. In an attempt to soften the blow, leaders shifted toward easing again. Markets became confused, then volatile. Investors didn't know which direction policy would swing next. Companies stopped trusting forecasts. Households stopped trusting stability. Predictability, the backbone of prosperity, evaporated. This confusion revealed a truth few were willing to say aloud. The system wasn't being guided by strategy anymore. It was being driven by fear. Fear of recession. Fear of inflation. Fear of political backlash. Fear of repeating the mistakes of the past. And decisions made from fear rarely build stability. They often accelerate fragility. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, another consequence was forming. As interest rates rose and fell unpredictably, something fundamental cracked. Long-term planning. Nations postponed infrastructure. Companies froze innovation budgets. Individuals delayed milestones, homes, families, careers. A society that stops planning slowly loses its sense of direction. And that directionlessness created a vacuum instability eagerly filled. Financial markets picked up on this first. Yield curves warped. Bond markets whipsawed. Currencies weakened suddenly. These weren't random movements. They were signals of a world operating without a clear anchor. A ship drifting while its crew argued over which way north even was. But perhaps the most dangerous outcome wasn't economic, it was psychological. People began to feel that the world was becoming unmanageable, that institutions had lost their grip, that no one was truly in control. That doubt, once seated, spreads faster than any financial contagion. And as it spreads, it changes how societies behave. Before we reach that moment, there's one more subtle transition worth noticing: the rise of fragmented realities. As trust eroded, people stopped believing in shared narratives. Some blamed institutions, others blamed elites, others blamed forces they couldn't name. This fragmentation didn't create the crisis, but it magnified it. When societies lose a common understanding of what's happening, they also lose the ability to respond together. And a divided response is often no response at all. The drift continued slowly. In the next section, we'll explore the breaking point, the moment when uncertainty transforms into action, when societies shift from waiting to reacting. Because every countdown eventually reaches a moment where hesitation ends and consequences begin. The breaking point never arrives as a single explosive moment. It approaches gradually, like a shadow stretching across the ground long before you see what's casting it. By the time people sense something is wrong, the shift has already begun. Society moves from uncertainty to reaction, subtle at first, then unmistakably. It starts with households. After years of fluctuating prices, unpredictable policies, and inconsistent signals, families begin to change their behavior. They save more, spend less, avoid long-term commitments. Not because they are pessimistic, but because their instincts tell them the ground beneath them is no longer solid. And instinct, once awakened on a large scale, becomes a force more powerful than any policy. Then businesses follow. Companies delay major investments, cut expansion plans, and save cash. Innovation slows not due to lack of ideas, but because uncertainty strangles the courage required to take risks. Economies built on confidence start to feel heavier, slower, colder. Governments sense this chill too. They attempt grand announcements, sweeping programs, renewed promises of security. But the public no longer hears reassurance in these messages, they hear desperation. When people feel that leaders are reacting instead of leading, their trust fractures further. And fractured trust changes how nations behave. Social tensions rise next. Not dramatically at first, but like tension thickening in the air. Communities split over interpretations of the crisis. Some demand aggressive intervention, others demand restraint. Some blame external threats, others blame internal ones. Narratives drift apart until they barely resemble each other. Without shared understanding, cooperation becomes difficult. And difficult cooperation becomes fertile ground for conflict. Markets mirror this division. Volatility becomes normal, not exceptional. Investors behave with the jittery urgency of people grabbing possessions before a storm. Money flows in unpredictable patterns into safe havens one week, into risky bets the next. This isn't strategy, it's instinct. And yet, even as these fractures appear, the final breaking point still feels distant. That is the most dangerous illusion. Because the real collapse doesn't begin when systems fail, it begins when people start acting as if they might. Behavior shifts become self-reinforcing. Saving leads to reduced spending. Reduced spending slows growth. Slowed growth reinforces fear. Fear accelerates saving again. A loop that tightens like a noose. At this stage, the countdown enters its final phase, the moment when small shocks cause outsized reactions. A minor political dispute becomes a market event. A routine policy change sends currencies spinning. A distant conflict triggers domestic unrest. Fragility becomes so widespread that the entire system behaves like glass, rigid and one impact from shattering. But there is one last element, the one most people never notice until it's too late: the psychological threshold. Every society has a point where collective patience turns into collective action. A point where people stop waiting for stability to return and start preparing for it not to. Once that threshold is crossed, the direction of history shifts quickly. Before we reach that moment, there is one more subtle transition worth noticing: the rise of fragmented realities. As trust eroded, people stopped believing in shared narratives. Some blamed institutions, others blamed elites, others blamed forces they couldn't name. This fragmentation didn't create the crisis, but it magnified it. When societies lose a common understanding of what's happening, they also lose the ability to respond together. And a divided response is often no response at all. The drift continued slowly. And as we move toward that threshold, the signals become clearer. You see it in conversations that feel heavier, in headlines that repeat patterns, and leaders whose voices shake. It's in the way ordinary people talk about the future, not with excitement, but with caution. These shifts may seem small, but together they mark the final steps toward the moment everything turns. In the final section, we'll step into that moment, the instant the countdown hits zero. Not with noise, but with a quiet realization that the world has already changed. The moment the countdown hits zero almost never looks like the catastrophe people imagine. There's no siren, no headline announcing a collapse, no dramatic turn that history books love to exaggerate. Instead, the shift arrives quietly, like waking up one morning and realizing the world feels slightly, unmistakably different. Not broken, not destroyed, just altered. As if some internal gear has slipped into a new position, and everything around you is now running on a different rhythm. It begins with small signals. A government issues an emergency measure that feels oddly routine. A major corporation announces a restructuring to prepare for long-term challenges. A currency moves too sharply for comfort, then stabilizes only halfway back. None of these events alone mark a collapse. But together, they whisper that the old equilibrium is gone. People sense it first in their habits. They check prices more carefully. They question long-term plans they once took for granted. They talk about the future with a tone that blends caution and resignation. It's not fear is loud. This is quieter, heavier. It's the moment people stop assuming tomorrow will look like yesterday. Institutions sense it too. Governments accelerate emergency funds, not because the crisis is here, but because they expect it. Central banks communicate with a new stiffness, a carefulness that reveals more than their words do. Agencies revise forecasts so frequently that the forecasts lose authority. These are not reactions to chaos. They are signs that the system has entered a new phase one where stability must be manufactured daily. Global markets reflect this change with a nervous pulse. Volatility becomes the default setting. Safe assets rise even on calm days. Riskier assets react sharply to minor headlines. Investors no longer trade based on fundamentals alone. They trade on sentiment, on fragility, on the fear of being one step late. The market stops behaving like a machine and starts behaving like a crowd. But the deepest shift happens socially. People begin forming new alliances, some seeking security, others seeking direction, others seeking someone to blame. Movements grow quickly, fueled not by ideology, but by dissatisfaction and uncertainty. Political landscapes shift. Conversations change tone. A collective restlessness spreads, subtle yet pervasive. This is the true zero moment. Not a crash, but a transition. A point where the previous world order loses its center of gravity, and a new one struggles to form. It is a slow unraveling of assumptions. The belief in constant growth. The belief in predictable cycles. The belief that institutions can always correct their course. One by one, these assumptions loosen their grip. And from this loosening emerges opportunity, but also danger. Because when the old framework dissolves, societies must choose what comes next. Some move toward cooperation, rebuilding trust and resilience. Others move toward division, seeking certainty through conflict. History shows both paths. Which one emerges depends not on markets or governments, but on how people interpret the moment. In this transitional phase, the biggest risk isn't economic collapse, it's misreading the environment. Thinking the worst is over when it's only beginning. Believing stability has returned because a chart looks calmer. Confusing quiet with safety. The world doesn't reset with a bang. It resets through hundreds of small shifts that accumulate until the old rules no longer apply. And this is where the world stands now, between the fading echoes of the previous era and the quiet formation of the next one. A liminal space, tense and uncertain, where every decision carries more weight than it appears. A world waiting, some with fear, some with hope, most with confusion. The final truth is this: turning points never feel like turning points in real time. They feel like drift, like fog, like slow motion. Only when we look back do we realize the countdown ended long before we understood what it meant. And by then, the world has already crossed into its new phase. This video has traced that journey from early signals to the breaking point, from reaction to transformation. Not to frighten you, but to give you clarity. Because in times of transition, clarity is power. And those who understand the moment are the ones who shape what comes next.